All right, everybody. Hello, and now we're meeting with Jason-Foumberg. And Jason, here we are again with the global ability of this internet and webinars. Jason lives in Chicago, but he's hanging out in Los Angeles for the time being. And we did a dry run this morning that I'm glad we got it resolved because it's all smooth right now. Maybe you heard me ask Lisa, Jason, I want to know the same thing. Where did you go to high school? What did you think you were going to do? How did you get from, from high school to where you are at the moment?
Paul, it's a funny question. People always ask where you went to college or where you went to school, and then they mean college. They never ask about high school. But I went to high school in a suburb of Los Angeles, a very small one called Oak Park, and I sort of hung out with the outside. I was sort of an outsider. I really was an outsider, and hung out with an alternative crew. And instead of going to football games, we would go to museums, art museums, and just that sort of sold me. It sort of became really interested in art, especially contemporary art. We went to the Getty, to the Museum of Contemporary Art, and in 1999, my last year of high school, I begged my way into the Getty, volunteering in the Department of Drawings, a curatorial department, and I volunteered there a couple days a week and just did office work, and I found that I loved it. Actually, the people who worked there discouraged me from working in museums, but what an amazing place to work where you're around art all the time, and I pursued it, and I got my bachelor's in art history in Santa Barbara, and then I got my master's in art history again from Chicago at the School of the Art Institute, and I stayed there. That's my rise to art in Chicago, I suppose. I just love, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I just loved what Lisa said sort of toward the end. I just wrote it down because it was so pertinent. I really didn't want anybody to miss it. She said that people who buy artwork don't know much about it. I thought that was so interesting, and I find that to be true all the time. So much of our job as artists or on this side of the art world is education, is educating people who buy art, because we view those people as the collectors, as the people who have so much power. I just thought it was really interesting. I just find that to be true in every facet of what I do.
I think that was certainly true for me as an art dealer. Was a lot of it's educating, and if you educate with enthusiasm, people tend to appreciate it. I think the first thing that you have to do as an educator, as a teacher of any sort, is to be exciting or to show passion and show that you care. And I think that as an artist, you probably have a role to educate also, and that if you educate, with a passion, people get enthusiastic about it, and maybe they get what I used to call the gimmies, where that they want to buy something. When you went to art school, Jason, was that in the intent of journalism, or was it with the intent of being an artist or an artist? What affinity did you have?
No, I never went with the intention of being an art critic. I actually, in my undergrad, I was working on a dual degree of art history, and in Santa Barbara, they have this interesting program of you can major in altered books. So I was proceeding on that track at the same time as an artist, and I didn't end up getting that degree fully. I was just the class or two short, and it was time to leave. It's sort of being an art historian or doing art history. You're writing by default. That's the craft that you have to develop because you're always writing. Part of it is looking, and part of it is writing. But I never did study journalism. I'm sort of a self-taught journalist. Maybe we just segue into my little spiel. I have about a 30 to 40 minute talk about what I do as an art critic and how I operate as an art critic in the art scene. And depending on how fast I talk, it'll be about 30 to 40 minutes, as I said, and then we can definitely do Q&A.
Fabulous. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I'd also like to talk about the relationships that artists can have with art critics. So a little bit about me. I write for Newcity. and I'm also the editor of the art section there. I've been doing that for about 5 years. Newcity is a survivor publication, and it's an alternative news weekly. Sometimes people call that an alt weekly, focused on art and culture, and it's in Chicago. So we focus only on stuff that's in Chicago. It's locally owned, and it's been in operation since 1986 and distributed citywide. I do writing weekly about art in Chicago, and the city is really my beat. I write about art in venues, from the street to the museum, artists from emerging to famous. I also, under me, I have writers in their art section, and I assign reviews to them and artist profiles, and I edit their writing. Additionally, I write for some art magazines, such as Frieze, Modern Painters, and Photograph. And the sort of writing I do for them, which is also reviews, the scope is a little different, and I'll get back to that sort of near the end. Additionally, I curate exhibitions independently. Like you guys, I send cold proposals to venues. Sometimes artists hire me to do that. I enter competitions with curatorial ideas, and I apply for grant money. Sometimes I'm hired by artists to write exhibition catalogs. And all this sounds like full-time work, but it's actually my part-time job. It's sort of like a bad cell plan where it's nights and weekends. And my full-time job is I work at the Art Institute of Chicago in a curatorial department, prints and drawings, and I'm the department manager there. I'm not a curator, but I do admin work in a museum. So to get to the sort of the meat of my talk, I wanted to just reflect on a panel discussion that I heard at the MCA. It was about a year ago. It was about art scenes in general, and a little bit about Chicago as well. It was with Michelle Grabner and also the new chief curator, Michael Darling, who we talked about just an hour ago. And he named off different things that a healthy scene includes, a healthy art scene, and that is strong. He listed them off. Strong institutions, good art schools, artists, of course, I hope, commercial galleries, and collectors. And he did not mention critics. And this was surprising to me because he used to be a critic writing for the same magazine that I currently do, which is Frieze magazine. So I took it personally, but also for all of his great sound bites that he offers in his lectures, this seemed a misstep. Because the art world is not made up of discrete individuals or separate categories of collector, artist, dealer, critic, educator, whatever, functioning in their own bubbles. But I believe that we're all interconnected, that we have relationships where we support each other, where we learn from each other, where we lean on each other and even push each other. For example, people often ask me how I choose which shows to review. And while I do make up my own mind of what I review, logistically, I see shows that are open. I see shows at galleries, museums, established venues that house or show art. So the art already exists in that space before I arrive. It's already available. There is already a contract between the artist and curator and dealer there. And I have a relationship, since I have a readership, my readers want to know what to go see, what's new. It's certainly right. I can certainly write an artist profile of somebody who has no representation from a gallery or a reputation, which I have and do. But I also act as a journalist, so I go after what's timely, what's new, what's open. I go see what has already, in a sense, been selected by another person or entity, institution. Although my writing practice happens solo and I'm alone when I write, I exist in this network of venues, institutions, people with titles, people who have done their studio visits and vetted the art. Whether that's a private collection that I'm interested in reviewing, or I pull feature stories from a grant award announcement, or I pull profile ideas from an exhibition review panel that I'm on. These are established systems that I reach into. And in turn, I hope, and often maybe people reach from me, such as, say, if I've written something, a curator may be researching an artist and reference my writing. I'm not trying to say that these are the only proper channels for getting a critic's attention. For instance, I often just turn on my email or Facebook and see if an artist has sent me an exhibition notice. And it's my job to seek out outsiders, but I feel that it's a holistic model of mutual engagement. I can't find you if you're silent and invisible. So there's many different types of art writing. I'm going to sort of list them and talk about them, not in any order of importance. Journalism, there's journalism and news. Bloggers are doing this a lot now. Really hard factual stuff, investigative stuff, where they talk about the ethics of the art world, conflicts of interest. There's a sort of watchdogs of the museums, and Peter Sheldall calls them the hall monitors of the art world. Headlines certainly capture attention because they engage conflict. Tragedy is entertaining. George Carlin says that, I think. But the stuff is fleeting, and while many websites value the sort of attention for the paid views they get, I do believe it's fleeting and not always the most substantial attention we want in our art world. There's also theoretical writing or theory, in which case an opinion or judgment is not always expressed by the writer. Maybe that's if the judgment is implicit in the fact that the writer is writing about a certain artist, and they give validity to it by its selection as a topic. Related, there's art history, in which the art historian interprets and situates the artwork along its time. A critical review is often a lot of description, and I believe it should have an opinion, a judgment embedded in that review by necessity. Otherwise, it's just description. Mostly, perhaps, reviews are only read by the artist reviewed. Another related type of writing is the feature or profile of an artist. It's a human interest story. There's a narrative, a biography about how an artist got to do what they're doing and why. That sort of thing often appears in the New Yorker. Those are especially good examples of that sort of writing. There's also promotional writing, such as an artist catalog. When I get hired to do an artist catalog, I don't ever, in a critical review I can be negative, but when I'm hired to do an artist catalog, I'm never negative. I sort of view those opportunities as room to be creative and to do creative writing, and I really enjoy that sort of writing greatly. Another type of promotional writing is a press release. I believe that very few people read press releases. They're usually written by your agent or your dealer, and I often don't read them because they sort of taint or sully my initial response to an exhibition. Another type of writing is educational, such as a catalog written by a museum or the wall text produced in the museum. Newcity is the newspaper, so I don't often or really ever know who's reading it. I have to assume that anyone is reading it because it's just distributed throughout the city. When I write, I'm like tossing it out into the ether, the unknown. Maybe someone got inspired. Maybe a homeless person is using it as toilet paper. It's sort of like being an artist. There's no guarantee that it matters, but the goal is to make it matter. I think that the present local coverage in Chicago and perhaps many other cities is infuriating for its lack of depth. It's often anti-intellectual. It reaches sort of populist, and as it does so, it talks down to its audience. Personally, I write for an ideal reader. This is not grandma and grandpa, but for someone who I wish exists in the world. The educated reader who likes to read long-form writing, curious about the world, and will get off their ass to see an exhibition. So why does this stuff get written? Why must something so visual need a written component? Boris Groys, who's a great writer about art, says that images without text are embarrassing, like a naked person in a public space. I've heard people say, and this is a quote, "I'm going to die if I don't get a review." And I've also heard people say that there are no statues to art critics, that critics are not heroic in any way. The blogger Patty Johnson has written that without criticism, art is just another luxury market. For some artists, writing is a free marketing opportunity. It's, say, if you're an author and you had a book out, it's your back cover pull quote. On the other hand, often I hear artists say they work really, really hard to produce an exhibition, and then they install it, and then nothing, silence. It can be anticlimactic. So I believe that an art critic is a representation of your audience. Your friends at your opening are going to pat you on the back and say, "It's great, great work." A critic represents an educated, thoughtful general public, your art audience. Half my job is to get the word out about your art, that it exists and it's on view. The other half is to receive it. I'm your audience. So this part of my talk is just some bullet points about how to behave with an art critic. Often I hear people say that, that they don't know any art critics, so I'm just going to give you some sort of friendly advice, I guess. I'm quiet personally when I'm around art. I'm slow to consider what's being presented to me, take my time to receive the work and to think about it. I like when artists talk to me in the studio about their methods and sources, but I don't like a canned speech. Often artists, not often, but sort of maybe the more famous artists have a grand narrative about who they are and where they came from. Like Barbara Kruger, she used to be a graphic designer. Carl Andre used to work at a steel mill. So these myths exist about the artist's biographies. And perhaps it's good for you to manufacture your own myth. It's an important beginning. It's an icebreaker. But personally, I'll always try to find the other stories. That story is already established now in the art world. Ultimately, talking to a critic or anyone who visits your studio, it's important to be honest and to talk to them about what interests you, whether that's your art or not. And if it's not about your art, if you're talking about something else, that's often where I like to draw information from for my, say, if I'm writing an artist profile, what you did that day, about who you are. Not necessarily just about the materials you're using, but about your life. If you want to make an art critic happy, give them a story. Critics want breaking news. They want never been revealed. They want stories, information that's never been revealed to the world before. Critics can be competitive. We don't all want to tell the same story. We want scoops. Make a friend by giving news to a journalist. Sometimes critics battle over the meaning of an artwork. I think that you cannot copyright an idea, but critics act as if you can. We want to be highly original, but we're dependent on you being original first. We like to claim ownership of an artwork's meaning, and we compete to understand it, to explain its reason for being. If you're working in an unusual environment, in unusual circumstances, or with unusual materials, and so on, invite an art critic to your studio and tell them what you're doing. We'd love to report on it. Another piece of advice is just, you've probably heard this before, but just to reiterate, have good images, current images on your website and exhibition announcements. If you're sending them via email, websites are often the first interface for me because I see so much in Chicago, and it's also, I'll look at them as follow-up to an exhibition I've seen. Even a Tumblr, I don't care if there's a fancy design, I just want big detailed images. Also on that website, keep your CV and exhibition history up to date. Yeah, usually an opening is the best place to talk to me. It's when I'm feeling social, and it's a good place for making introductions. However, if I'm reviewing your show, I usually don't want to talk with you very much at first. I want a pure look at the work, especially given the current state of art criticism. Few people are getting paid, few are writing well. A review just should not be taken for granted. It's a labor of love for the writer to spend time with your work. It takes a long time to thoughtfully work out a review or a piece of writing about art. Sometimes I find out about art on a website or I'm tipped off by somebody else, and I'll just email the artist and invite myself over to their studio. Some people find this intrusive and awkward that I invite myself over, and I don't always know what I'm doing there. Maybe I'm not writing an article about you. I don't know what I'm going to write about maybe that week until I'm writing about it. So just be open in those situations to having a conversation. You don't know what might come from it. Maybe not something immediate, but it's likely that you'll just be stored in the back of my head for the future. And speaking of studio visits, I just love when artists show me everything. Sketchbooks, false starts, don't clean out before I get there. And also, afterward, follow up in a few months. If you showed me something that was in progress during the studio visit, send me an email with the finished artwork and say, hey, I finished this series and I just wanted you to see, you know, what I've been working on. I think that especially when I go to a studio or talk to you on my own volition at the beginning of a relationship, the critics, I say this myself, but I also think it's true universally, critics want to champion an artist, and we sort of want to rise together. Generally, I won't review exhibitions in cafes or coffee shops, restaurants, bars, or street fairs. I don't find those to be the most relevant environments for appreciating art. I do believe we need more art in our lives, intervening in our public spaces, but one must be strategic about where one shows. It can be pigeonholing to show in cafes and coffee shops. You don't want to become that kind of artist. It's not something I like to see on a CV or exhibition history when doing a grant review, for example. But as a point of contradiction, or maybe difference, I do review art shown in basements, garages, apartments, on the street, under the L track. I do like to support emerging artists and write about their shows, but I also like to write about the same artists over and over again because I like to see how they transform and develop. I believe that sustained critical attention is really important, just as important perhaps as an artist's first clip or their first review. A little bit more about Newcity. It's not just me running the show; it's a whole team of people who work there at the newspaper. There's theater, culture, news, food, criticism, film. We often have artists designing covers for Newcity. When Fitzpatrick has done some. Chris Ware got his start publishing reviews. I'm sorry, not reviews. His comics in Newcity. I love Newcity because it's unique. It's independent. It's an alternative newspaper. And there's a really strong division between editorial and the ad man. It's that line of church and state is just crucial to maintaining our professional standards. I'm not hired at Newcity to write about certain shows or artists. When you see that line crossed in art writing, it's really apparent and easy to see that it's often such bad writing. It's a press release or advertorial, is what they're calling it now. And to me, that's not art criticism, and I often just won't read it. People often ask me about the digital revolution, about how art critics are surviving the digital revolution. Certainly, Newcity that's been around since the mid-'80s has had to come to terms with itself with the big push to digital. Our website mirrors our printed content, so it's accessible anywhere. That's a given. I think all newspapers are doing that now. But also, we've been using the digital format to enhance printed format. We have Google Map online where it shows all the locations of all the drop boxes around Chicago where you can get an actual printed copy of Newcity, whether it's a street box or at a bar or an art venue. I think that sort of thing has sort of been not available prior to the internet. But we still do print, and it's been important for the publisher to keep on doing print. So I've had to think of ways how to present ourselves as a unique print publication, as a keepsake. One was recently I did a cover story for Newcity of an artist project where I asked artists to create impossible, imaginary, and impractical public monuments for Chicago, things that couldn't be built. So there were sketches in the style of Paul-Klein who did that in the 60s. And I hoped that that was something that people could view as, oh, that this is, you know, perhaps an artist publication for artists, by artists. And that helps distinguish a print edition as a material object that people want to have. As I'm the editor for the art section, so I have about 10 to 15 freelance writers that report to me. Some of them are artists. Most of them, I'd say, are artists. It's part of their creative practice to do writing. Donald Judd did great art criticism in the 60s, and that model persists. It's a way for artists to wrangle about what they make or the trends that they are situated in, or to identify with other artists. And maybe they're creating a scene as they're publishing reviews and such. if you're an artist who likes to write, I encourage you to do so, whether it's a blog or if you can find another vehicle for that writing. I have some rules, some behind-the-scenes rules that I'll share with you. One is that I tell them to never use the word interesting. It's the least interesting word that you can have in print. That's so unspecific. In criticism, in Newcity, we like to have, we call it the microscope and telescope, where other people are using a microscope, we use a telescope to focus on a larger trend. Other people are using a telescope, we use a microscope to just completely detail to death whatever an artist is working on. If one of my writers is reviewing a group show, I ask them not to describe every single work in the show, but to give a larger thematic picture. Perhaps a review exists because, for the purpose that if you didn't see the show, you can get a sense of what was there, but I don't think that that should be purely description. I always ask my writers, when I help them maintain a readability in their writing. That is, the writing should always be informative, fresh, engaging, and even inspiring, I hope. But reading, the part of the reader, it should not be work for the part of the reader. The writing is the part that's hard. It should be made easy for the reader to move through. I ask my writers to never admit being confused in writing, and to say up front in the writing that they don't know what the art is about. The first take of an art at an exhibition may be confusing, but I always want them to push through that, beyond that. Good writing does not have empty or vague platitudes, and that's stuff that I see, you know, it's endemic to the art world. I see it in artist statements, exhibition reviews, catalogs, and so on. I have some examples of stuff that just make my skin crawl. These are quotes from stuff I have a little list of stuff that I use as examples not to use. The work is charged with tension. You know, you see that a lot, that there's this tension that makes the work so important. That the work is critical without indicating of what the work is critical of or why. That the artist deconstructs social code. That the art puts our habitual way of seeing into question, as if that it has more agency than it really does. This is sort of fluffy writing. It's placeholders for real content, and it fills up word count, but it's not stuff that's really worth reading. I always want my writers to have their own taste and their own point of view, to be an expert on something. I don't want their writing to be dumbed down for the layman, whoever that is. But I want really high ideas, special topics presented in an accessible way. People often ask me about negative reviews. If a writer pitches a review to me of a show that they haven't seen yet, and then they go see the show, and the art is bad, I ask them to write the review anyway. There was an example about 2 years ago of a venue who got perhaps 4 out of 5 negative reviews from us. I wasn't keeping count, but it was enough negative reviews where they came to me and they said, "Hey, what's up?" You know, and the gallerist said, maybe it was actually a nonprofit space, and they said, maybe I'm in the wrong line of work, or maybe my artists are. And I said, I don't tell my writers what to write. And he said, but you do decide what to publish. And so the space was getting a lot of buzz at the time. Writers were curious, and they wanted to see what was up and what the buzz was all about. So they were pitching the reviews to me. And one doesn't necessarily know how one feels about a show until the writing gets started. Even you may be thrilled at the exhibition, but once the writing gets started, that's when things really get fleshed out. So I asked my writers to be truthful, and I explained all of this to the gallerist, and I believe that we saw eye to eye on this, and we grew to understand each other's roles in the art world a bit more, and we do have a better relationship, I think, to this day because of it. For Frieze magazine, which is based in London and it's circulated internationally, distributed internationally, I've been writing for them for about 4 years. I don't pitch negative reviews to them. It's a chance for me when I write for them to increase the volume of my loudspeaker as a critic, and to tell the world how great something is often more than likely in Chicago, and that sort of thing is really important for artists in Chicago, which is not New York, to be getting that loudspeaker. So I won't send them reviews of stuff that I know I'm going to write negatively about. Frieze wants to know often about known artists, not about super emerging artists that are not showing in galleries. The readers, to agree, want to read about what's popular or what will make them smarter. Often Frieze is telling you about an old book that no one's heard about, but everyone must know about. That's wildly influential just with artists. So it's that sort of thing. And so in that way, I'm limited a bit with the more national or international publications, just to write about things in a very specific way. Newcity, by chance of volume, does do more negative reviews. We publish about maybe 8 reviews per week, so they're not all that bound to be completely positive. But I believe that if there's negativity, it's criticality, it's part of this overall sense of taste that is being established in our contemporary moment. And I believe it's a guide to what we want for a healthful art scene. And it's not all negative. I don't want to end on a negative note. Once a year, I publish a cover story it's called Breakout Artists, that coincides with the Art Chicago Fair, and it's a way to champion emerging artists. And I usually try to write about people who don't have gallery representation, who are doing amazing things, sort of unsung in Chicago. And that's been about 8 years running. Now within past few years in exhibition component. So just as a way to promote artists in a really positive way. And so that's the end of my spiel, and I'm definitely welcome your thoughts and questions.
Fabulous, dude. I want to start with a question because I want to know that I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. And then why don't you guys have questions of Jason, start raising your hands and I'll get to you momentarily. I don't have as many questions of Jason as I did for others today. You're comfortable, am I right? You talked about championing an artist. I'm thinking of Clement Greenberg. I mean, are there artists that you specifically seek to augment their career and or their exposure of their artwork? Is that something you're comfortable with?
Certainly. There's certainly people that I believe in that I want to see succeed in a super possible way. It's not something I'm doing every day. I'm often moving so fast, week to week, that I want to see something new all the time. But sometimes there is an artist where I'm just in love with them, and I want to help them, and I want to put every show they have. I'm going to write about them, and often I've found that those relationships turn into that an artist will have a show in a museum, and they'll request me to write their catalog entry, and so it becomes reciprocal. Also, that we develop and cultivate a relationship. And
how many artists?
You mentioned Greenberg, so that's a historical model that he champions some artists. It's certainly important as to the structure and the way that this art world happens and works is that people be consistent and help out certain artists.
I write an art letter, right? And so, I don't call I got asked if I wanted to be a critic for a national magazine, and I said, I don't think I'm a critic, I think I'm a cheerleader. And, I can recommend some critics to you that, or people who could write and serve that role. But I think some of the critiques you made of, I'm sure I've said interesting way too many times, and some others, but I think on the whole I scored pretty okay. But one of the things that I say about what I do is that there's a lack of purity, and that, for example, people who take my class, this course, and have an exhibition I will go out of my way to see if I can write about it and be a proponent of what they do and cast it in a good light and get them, more exposure, which I find to be a specific lack of purity, which I'm comfortable with. How pure do you think your endeavor as an art critic writer is?
Well, Paul, if we're going to be honest, I'll tell you that I think it's not maybe the best practice for you to mix these two, the Klein-Artists-Works with your art letter. I've heard criticism from people that impurity of what you do is detrimental because it crosses the line for some people.
Interesting. I had not heard that. I appreciate the information.
Yeah. Purity is something that gets talked about a lot. Conflicts of interest is a term that's thrown around a whole lot, perhaps more so than it needs to be, but it's especially important when money is changing hands. Purity is also something I often have to deal with in a difficult way because I work at a museum full-time and I'm also an art critic. So in an ideal world, I would be one or the other, and I cannot write about the Art Institute of Chicago, and that's the biggest museum in Chicago, and I'm one of the only people publishing writing about art in Chicago. So there is something certainly wrong with that, but your experience publishing art letter and doing the Klein-Artists-Works shows, and my experience working in a museum and writing art criticism shows that you have to cobble these things together, and that you have to produce something that you feel good about, something that you feel is working for you and firing on every level. It's hard for me to not write about the Art Institute of Chicago as an art critic in Chicago because they're doing great exhibitions that I would love, and ones that I think are terrible that I would love to pull apart, and I have more insight and insider information than anybody ever could have, but I'm not going to, I certainly can't ruin right now I certainly cannot pull those threads apart. It's problematic, but it's something I have to be super careful about as an art critic and as somebody who works at a museum, a public institution. But yeah, I think that's, unless you have any more questions about that, I think that's all I have to say.
So are you pure, or are you, okay, so you're more pure than me. But
it's something that I know that conflicts of interest are on many, many people's minds, and whether it's just because people like to stir the shit and or because it really matters to people, I don't think these many conflicts of interest should matter. Like, for instance, you mixing Klein-Artists-Works with the art letter, I take it with a grain of salt, but it's not something where I completely discount you. Maybe some people do. For me, I have to be careful because my livelihood depends on it. I'm not paid a full-time salary with doing art criticism, but I am working at an art museum, so I have to be super careful, and I am, just it's by necessity. I don't rank people by pure or impure. Another facet of purity in the art world, or impurity, is people often perhaps wonder whether, if I write about something without being judgmental about it, for instance, say if I'm using Oprah or Lady Gaga as an example in an exhibition proposal, it doesn't necessarily mean that I love Oprah and I'm watching a lot of her Oprah episodes. It's simply that she's a relevant character in our society who's a representation of identity and how it's a malleable entity. That doesn't mean I like Oprah. So I think the term people use for that is a disinterested quality of the art critic, in that we can write about anything whether or not we like it. That's something that is difficult for me to always adhere to. It's sort of a 19th century idea or something. I certainly have my personal taste. I do like to play around with ideas and be creative. If I'm going to talk about Oprah, I'm completely willing to in an art context.
I got to ponder some of this stuff. Damn. Okay, while I'm doing that, let's see what Suzanne has to say. Suzanne, I'm unmuting you. You're unmuted.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks so much for the presentation, and your thoughts about purity actually strike deep into my heart, because I've spent most of my life being an artist, but have tried to stay very true to who I am, and part of that has been keeping it very pure. At this point in my life, I'm trying to branch out and be a little more adventuresome with getting the work into new places, you know, even looking for gallery representation, and I very much enjoyed the range of people that Paul has brought to this to these seminars. So my question for you is, with that as a little bit of a context as to who I am, part of what I'm also looking for is to have art critics write about, you know, what I'm doing. Now, I live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, so I live in a very rural place. I am reaching out to other cities in more urban areas and that kind of thing. But from your perspective, do you have any thoughts on how I might begin to have a conversation with an art critic, or someone who might, you know, somewhere down the line be interested in coming here, going skiing, and writing something about what I do?
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting question for sure. This wasn't part of your question, but you just mentioned it in the sort of introduction to your question about different methods of reaching out and getting gallery representation. That sort of thing is not selling out. Getting in contact with somebody like Lisa, who will place your art, is not selling out. Even if it looks like decoration, I think that's completely fine. That's part of being a full-time artist.
Yeah.
But your question about how to reach out to a critic or get a review or a piece of writing if you were in outside of an urban center with a smallish art scene, you know, there's no formula to it. Recently I was contacted by some artists and educators in Kansas City who had written a proposal to the Warhol Foundation, and their proposal, which is based in Pittsburgh, and they have, I believe, and they have, the Warhol Foundation has a lot of money, and they've started granting, sending out grants to people who can become platforms for bigger art scenes in their city, specifically in a place like Kansas City, which maybe has a vibrant art scene, but doesn't have a huge loudspeaker for the rest of the nation or the world. So these people contacted me and said, hey, we got money from the Warhol Foundation. Our proposal was to bring you from Chicago to Kansas City to do studio visits with some artists and to do a lecture, and also to contribute something to this new publication that we're trying to get off the ground. So, you know, that was seemed like a huge collaborative effort on their part, just to get this proposal written and accepted, and then the third phase was to get people outside of the city into the city. Certainly, that's not an easy thing to do, but it was something that really struck me as a super like energetic and amazing thing to do, that they were so motivated. You know, a lot of the publications are like, say, Art Forum or Frieze or the New Yorker are just not focusing on the smaller cities. And maybe those are not the places to start pitching ideas to. Maybe it's maybe you can engage if there's an art writer in your city. You know, perhaps it's important to seek them out, and the internet is a good tool for that. Not just to hold an open studio on a Friday night, but to really invite people in, people you may not know, and people with a public persona. I think the bottom line is to engage yourself, like I said in the beginning of my my spiel, is to just engage yourself in as many facets of the art world as possible to expose your art to as much audience as you can. Any follow-up question about that?
Yeah, I got one. I mean, you said, and I think it might have to do something with the stage of the career, but you said, you know, don't necessarily show in coffee houses, and now you just said show in every opportunity you get. And I suppose, you know, I always felt that context was important, but we've had discussions with people who have quoted Richard Serra saying you should show every opportunity you get to show. I know accomplished artists who have never turned down an exhibition opportunity, and I know accomplished artists who are very selective about what kind of exhibits they show in. Do you think artists who should show at every opportunity, or they should be, you know, where do you feel on this?
I think you should understand your audience, or what sort of audience you're intending to cultivate. If your intention is to sell everything you make, you know, maybe abstract painting right now doesn't need criticism. Maybe it needs a sales catalog, and so that's still a certain type of writing and a certain sort of contact, a certain sort of format, but it's not everything it's not everything under the umbrella of the art world. You know, it's specific. I think you want to really be honest with your own intention. If your intention is to right now, like for instance, I'm not writing about every shellac painting that I see. I'm really interested in new forms, unusual context, and so that's getting my attention as a critic, and I think that's getting curators' attention. It's also people who have been working under the radar for a long time, I think, is getting a lot of curatorial attention. I've set people. It's interesting, the question of showing at cafes and restaurants and bars. I mean, often the lighting is not good there. Are you going to want to be showing your art in less than ideal conditions? Food's not allowed in a gallery. Should food be allowed in your around your art? You know, those are really stupid, perhaps simple questions, but maybe necessary to think about. I had another thought about cafes, and it's a really complicated question about that sort of context. But I think
I agree. My mind isn't made up, but I've heard different kinds of advice coming from different directions. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, personally, I won't review that stuff. I know that the director of Monique Meloche Gallery, if you're not in Chicago, that's a established gallery with a collector base. She's starting to do public projects, curate public projects, and show stuff in restaurants. Her idea is to bring cutting-edge art to restaurants where it has never existed before. And her first show was photography. And so we have a photography critic on staff at Newcity, and I forwarded the request to him. He's been writing for Newcity for 20 years. And he said, I won't review stuff at a restaurant. I never knew that about him. But I think it's something that may be universal across the board.
Let's go back to the art critic writing catalog essays. Are there artists you just have to find a polite way to say, I can't do this, I'm too busy, which really means I don't want to write about your schlock?
Have I ever turned down an essay for pay?
Not too many.
I don't think I have, but I don't get asked to do that many. You know, I have maybe 15 essays under my belt. They're expensive for artists and institutions to do if they contract an outside writer. One time I was contacted by a PR agent who was representing an artist based in Abu Dhabi. And it was just the shittiest shit I've ever seen. And they said, we need promotional writing. And I said, okay, I will do promotional writing. I threw that line for myself, and I will write about it as promotional text. And I said, I don't want to sign this work. It's going to be in their promotional packet, not a review. I would prefer not to sign it, and they were okay with that.
Does that mean that your name wouldn't appear with it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, my name didn't appear with it, and and it paid extraordinarily well. And it sustained. It was at a time when I was very struggling to pay my bills, and maybe it was a compromise, or maybe it was just the reality. And the funny thing is, interesting thing is, I found myself once I was writing it that I could use the language that I had learned how to use with stuff that I cared about in an extremely interesting, important way. That I could use this writing and apply it, and maybe I didn't have the passion for it, but I could sort of insert myself into it. A weak moment, but a reality, I suppose, as I said.
Interesting.
But today I really, that's sort of when an artist or a gallery contacts me to do a catalog essay, it's something that I love to do, and I know that they're asking me to do it because they're giving me carte blanche to write how I want to write about it. I recently did something for 3 Walls for the artist Betsy Odom, and her display was like a bridal registry at Macy's. Her objects were on tables for purchase. So the idea was to do an experimental piece of writing where I did like a Sears catalog or something like that, where I was doing product descriptions, and they had all this sexual innuendo because the artwork did. And so it was just not straightforward. It was created in the same way that the art was. Doing that sort of stuff is just, I feel like it's empowering for me to do it. It's empowering for the artist. Contribute something that perhaps couldn't get made with little to no pay. It's sort of like doing an artist commission. It's like you're given money to go balls out to just make something that you've never made before.
Do you feel this? I don't want this to be too loaded a question. Do you feel sufficient fulfillment writing for Newcity for the next 25 years, or do you have other kinds of aspirations, or do you not focus on this, or I shouldn't ask the question?
No, that's fine. Newcity, it's, Newcity, the great thing about Newcity is that I have complete freedom to write what I want as the editor of the art section, and that the senior editor of the magazine trusts that I'm going to write what I want to write, and that I'm doing it in the best way that's good for the art scene. Now, Newcity is not the highest publication on the totem pole of newspapers or of art publications, but it's been a great growing experience for me to just because I've had that freedom to know myself as a writer. I got started as a blogger, and so that sort of freedom has translated well into writing for Newcity. Now, I often do enter writing competitions and curatorial competitions, and apply for grants to do bigger projects with more impact, more audience. So it's something, I don't think I'll be writing for Newcity for the next 20 years. It's yeah, it's sort of hard to answer.
I would think,
but,
because I think you're doing a good job. You have, I guess the equivalent of artistic freedom, and I suspect the most significant art criticism voice and art criticism publication in the city of Chicago. That matters. You make a constructive difference to what goes on here. You become, like me, quantifiable. People can read what you write, and they can extrapolate from that to what they're going to think about the exhibit, regardless of whether you are complimentary or derogatory about it. People can, conclude that, oh, Jason doesn't like this. I think I might want to go see it. I think that's significant and it matters.
Yeah. And, also it's human ambition to want more, to want better. So Newcity is like the art letter. It can be a jumping off place to something more. Something, it could be your pedestal, and perhaps for bigger things.
Sure. Anybody else have questions for Jason? I think this has been really good. Pardon the expression, but it's been interesting.
The sign for speech. Oh, to clarify the sign for speech, but I never want to see it in writing.
You know, my mother taught me to say. My mother taught me to say it's interesting when I didn't like dessert. And you know, because it was such a meaningless term. So you know, I appreciate where you're coming from. Somebody raise a hand if it asks Jason something. I think he can also answer questions if you have them, you know, that are more generic about art critics in general, or art critics at other places, and how you approach somebody or what you do about a situation, and not only him. Anybody? You know, Jason, let me ask you a last question then, because I think, you know, I don't know. I asked Jerry Saltz's question, you know, like, what advice do you have for artists? What do you think about the market? What do you say to artists to be more successful? And Jerry said, I don't think about the market. Yeah. So asking you the same question, do you have the same answer, or do you want to volunteer something different?
You know, I mean, I don't go to art fairs except for the one that happens in our backyard in Chicago, because it's important. It's within my beat to know what's going on, but I don't travel outside of Chicago to go to art fairs. I think it's a poor viewing environment for art. I really don't care what the collectors are buying today. What's the most trendy thing? The art market. I mean, I've often found that collectors, while they are so important to the success of an artist's career, just simply are so can be so not knowledgeable about artwork. So I suppose I do agree. I've never really phrased it this way, but I suppose I agree that I don't pay too much attention to the art market. Often it's an interesting point of departure, the art market. Whatever is trendy, hip, and happening in the art market is a great place for me to say, you know, okay, if there's a list of 100 most powerful people in the art world, well, let's do a list of the 100 unsung heroes and the people who matter the least. You know, maybe that's an interesting article. How can we differentiate as artists and against this massive thing that often feels faceless and without identity, that's rolling along without you, controlled by these power players who have no money or time for you. I don't know. I think criticism can be a way to really be an alternative point of view, which is one reason why I just absolutely love writing for Newcity, is that it's an independent voice and it can just be a big fuck you to everything else and just be a big alternative to the established norms that, you know, here today, gone tomorrow. If we can say to an advertiser's exhibition that the show really sucked, you know, we'll survive regardless.
Do you suspect that there's a relationship with national publications, advertising dollars, and what they want to see covered?
Yeah, I suppose so. I recently wrote for Photograph magazine based in New York a review, and in the same issue, I noticed that the gallery had a full-page ad for the same show in that issue. And I'm not sure if there is a direct relationship. I do know that if the ad side of the publication is aware that something is going to be covered by the editorial, they'll go after an ad. It's how many publications have survived in the past, especially free publications without a subscriber base. It's all on ads. But the people who are buying the ads, the galleries and the corporations and the museums, really have to believe in the publication and in its voice, that it's going to be contributing something useful to the city and the art scene, whether they write something positive or negative.
You would say that what you write comes from your experience and who you are, and that your opinion isn't particularly for hire.
No, I don't. I don't know. My opinion is not for hire. It is based on. I write about. I follow my passion. You know, I'm off whatever sparks my interest. I move very quickly because I'm on a weekly deadline. It happens so fast that I'm just writing about what I think is awesome that week.
But all right, so you're coming from your core, and I would just assume that you want to write about artists who you feel are coming from their core as opposed to second-guessing their audience or the market or anything else, and you're looking for sincerity.
Sure, certainly. If I'm going to be writing about an artist in a straightforward way, if I'm going to be writing a review, often I write an art column, and the art column, it really has no boundaries. I can be writing media criticism, wrangling up all of the reviews of a certain show and saying, hey, sort of like the Daily Show, and saying, hey, all of you guys are idiots. Here's what's really going on, in a sort of a meta way. If an artist comes, usually I'll pick, if an artist is really infamous, comes across in an insincere way, that might be something fun to write about, their insincerity and why that matters or it doesn't. I won't do that to an emerging artist. I'm pretty sensitive to, the struggles of emerging artists. And if somebody comes across in a studio visit to me with weaknesses or doubts or insecurities, it's not something I'm necessarily going to report on. That sort of would be fair or helpful or interesting for a reader.
I think you've been respectfully brave a number of times that I'm aware of, and I like that. All right, Denise has a question. Go ahead, Denise.
First, I wanted to say thank you so much for this evening. You've been incredibly enlightening, and I have to take my hat off to you because I did not expect so much wisdom to come from a young person. I find that extremely refreshing, so kudos on that. But my real question is, if someone wants to send you a thank you letter,
Denise, your voice is breaking up entirely.
Is there a way for her to type it?
Denise, your voice is breaking up entirely. And there's a lot of echo and delay and stuff. Go ahead and type. I'm going to mute you, Denise. I think nod your head if what you're asking is if Jason will give us his physical address so that you can send him something. Is that what you're after, Denise? So, are you comfortable doing that, Jason?
I don't have a physical office except for the Art Institute, so feel free to email me anything. I'm like always on my email, and I'll download sort of any attachment and read whatever exhibition announcement and whatever you want to send me.
I'm going to post your email address. Are you cool with me giving these guys your email address? That's okay?
Yeah, it's also on the Newcity website.
Okay, and Mark has a question. Mark's joining us from England, and he stayed up a little bit late to hear you. Go ahead, Mark.
Good evening, Jason. Well, I've got a couple of questions that all go together. I wanted to know, are you a consumer of art yourself? What type of art are you into, and do you find that influences your perspective on what you're criticizing?
You asked if I'm an art consumer?
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Do you buy art?
No, I don't buy art. And I simply, first of all, don't have the means to spend a lot of money on art. It's often expensive. And secondly, I see a lot of art, and in a way, when I write about art, that is a way for me to consume it, and in a sense, a way for me to own it. That I sort of process the art in that way, and I won't need to hang it on my wall forevermore. So the only art that I own is things that friends have given me, and I don't own a lot of art.
So, but if you write if you write something about Joe Blow and Joe really likes what you've written and he gives you a work of art, are you comfortable with that? Do you turn it down? You take it gracefully?
I've taken art from people who I've written about, and I've done it quietly. I suppose it's not so quiet now that I'm admitting that. But I've never taken the art before the review has been written or published. When it comes as a thank you, it's completely as a surprise, and I don't take it to mean anything more than what it is as a thank you. It doesn't mean that it's a bribe, for instance. And it has happened so rarely that you know, I have this long hallway in my apartment. It's very Chicago style, and I've always dreamed of hanging art in there, filling with art, and there's maybe like 3 pieces. You know, it's just like I bought like a $20 print at a print sale of something that I just liked from somebody I don't know, and to a free poster taken from an exhibition. It's just, I just see so much art that I just don't necessarily need to own it in that way.
I understand that. You know, having had a gallery, it's really weird because, you know, I was selling things to people under the pretense that you have to have this, whereas I felt like I see art so much of the time, I don't need to have specific pieces hanging in my house. You know, now that I've got, you know, now I'm trying to buy art by a lot of Chicago people and have that because I feel like I'm supporting, you know, a scene and trying to grow it and et cetera like that. But I don't know, I kind of define a collector as someone who continues acquiring after their walls are full, and my walls are pretty full and I'm sort of slowed down big time. So Mark, you said you had more than one question, but I see that you've taken your hand down and remuted yourself. Are you done? Did you have another question?
No, well, each one was sort of intermingling from one to the other, whether he was a consumer and whether it influenced his perspective. That kind of stopped short there with,
Got it.
with his answer.
Sounds perfect. Okay. All right. Anybody else? I think we could wrap this up if we want. Does anybody else? Denise, your hand's still up, and I'm assuming you don't have another question. Unmute yourself if you do. Oh, her hand went down. All right. So, Jason, I think this is really interesting. You did this with us a year ago. This has been much more informative, and you've worked on this and come up with more information in a more concise order and presentation. As I've said to others, I'll send you a recording of this probably tonight that you can take a look at if you wish. It's always hard a little bit to watch yourself. I've sort of gotten used to it, but that doesn't mean well, whatever.
Yeah, but watching myself. But thank you, Paul. Thanks for everybody for listening.
And also, I'm going to have this transcribed at some point, and I will share that with you too. It may not be for a few months, but that's all happening. I'm unmuting everybody, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. The Chicago group are meeting on Friday, and everybody else, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you a ton. I appreciate it. Safe travels home. Good night.
Thank you. Bye. 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 Bye.
All righty. All righty.
Bye, everybody.